Welcome, welcome. I'm Kayla Russell Manson, Music Director of the Bennington County Choral Society. And before each concert, I think it's a wonderful thing, and I try to give you a little talk, chat, if you want to call it that, about what you're about to hear, and what we're sort of the ideas behind why we programmed the concert the way we have, as well as what you might expect to hear within the next hour or so, as well as what we're working on in the future. So as you look in your programs, you can see the theme is called The Advent of Our Joy. It's kind of a sort of a pastiche of a title, because of course the Bach cantata that we are doing, cantata number 62, is an Advent cantata. It's written for part of the Advent part of the liturgical year. And then the Harmonia Messe, and Harmonia is a German word, basically means wind band, right? So it does mean harmony, but in this term, in the sort of musicological sense, it refers to, a wind band. So the winds feature prominently in this particular mass. It's one of the final masses that Haydn wrote near the end of his life when he was an independently wealthy composer. So there, and that's something that's particularly unique about the arc of Haydn's life, as well as, as compared to maybe the arc of Bach's life. So you're looking at Bach, who started out pretty much the same way and sort of stayed in that vein. He was a private, patronized composer working in, dukes' households and such like that. He arrived to Leipzig in 1723, and his title was Thomas Cantor. And what that was it was a public position, which was a little unique for its time period. They still had courts and royal households that had musicians, Kapellmeisters and so forth. But Bach's job was he was the chief liturgical musician for all the major churches in town. So you had three big churches, two of which are Nikolaikirche and Thomaskirche. And he was responsible for writing, putting together, and disseminating all the liturgical music for these three churches, which is why, if you think about it, he ended up writing on the outside about 5 complete cycles of cantatas for the church year. So you think 52 weeks in a year, 5 times over. Okay, not all of them have survived to this day. There's still some fragments that seem to pop up magically over the period of time. Just like there's fragments of Mozart operas that seem to show up randomly. But think about the impact and how much work that had to be. Now, granted, Bach, like Haydn, Mozart, was a great economist, so he borrowed from himself a lot, obviously. And so you end up with this whole treasure trove of music and ingenuity and invention over a long, about 1723, he died in 1750, so a long period of time, probably the most prolific part of his life. What's interesting to note about the cantatas, though, is that they are meant to be part of a liturgical service. They're meant to observe something, and therefore they're tied to the lectionary of the day. And if you're, big into that, the lectionary has, 3 or 4 liturgical years that go through based upon whatever the gospel they're using. So there's a Luke year, and there's a Mark year, and there's a Matthew year. Each one of those days, you have a hymn of the day, which is a chorale. Now, mind you, we think of chorale, we see that word chorale, and we think of a group of people singing, right? And the term in this case actually refers to the tune, the hymn tune itself. That is the chorale, okay? And there's the particular tune that our cantata is written to, Nun komm der Heiden Heiland, Savior of the nations, or Savior of the heathen, come, is a Martin Luther. It was penned by Martin Luther himself. And it's a well-known Advent hymn tune. And he used that particular hymn tune thrice. So he wrote 3 cantatas based on this hymn tune. The first, Schwingt freudig euch empor, and then there's 2, Nun komm der Heiden Heiland, cantatas. This is the second of the 2, okay? Just kind of, as you said, recycled a bit. It was just, you have to write a lot of music for 3 separate churches all year long. You're going to do that to just keep things fresh. What's interesting, though, in terms of how he constructs these cantatas is that he makes it so that there's never a chance that you can lose sight of what the moral of the story is or what the tune is. So in almost every chorale-based cantata, the chorale tune is featured prominently either in the orchestra or there's a choral part, usually the sopranos and the tenors, but sometimes he hands it off to the altos. The basses never really get it. Where they sing the actual hymn in broken phrases. So what you'll hear in this cantata, in the first movement, you'll hear, of course, the counterpoint that he's constructed around the cantus firmus of the chorale tune before the choir comes in. And then you'll hear each phrase of the chorale tune sung by the sopranos. Okay, so the sopranos sing the Nun kommt der Heiden Heiland. So when you hear them come in, that's the tune. He has the oboes also play it before their entrance. Okay, but he doesn't leave it there. He actually has the chorale done in full harmonization at the end. And the cantata, it was a liturgical cantata, so it wasn't meant to just be performed, on behalf of everyone who was there. At the end of each cantata, the chorale was meant to be sung by the entire congregation. Now, that doesn't mean we expect you to sing it. You can just listen and be washed over it, and be washed over with the beauty of it. But it was meant to be a participatory experience. And if you've ever, one of the greatest joys that I got to do, particularly when I was in grad school, is I got to be a guest cantor, guest soloist at two of Bach's churches in Leipzig. And there's still the tradition to this day of when you do, particularly in the Passions, you notice that there are tons of chorales in the Passions throughout the Passions, the St. John Passion, St. Matthew Passion. Those chorales are sung by the congregation. Not necessarily in difficult four-part harmony, by the way, but they do sing the tune, right? They have that in their book, and they sing that when the chorales come up. But that's a particular stylistic thread, not just in the Passions, but throughout all of the cantatas, is that there is, of course, the scriptural text that we use, and that sort of girds the service or girds the Passion. But the solos almost always have some type of reflective text. So it's not scriptural, it's poetic, that reflects upon what's being talked about. So for instance, if you look in, take a moment after the talk and before the concert starts to look at what the tenor sings about and the bass sings about and the alto and soprano, they're reflecting on the wondrous mystery of the incarnation of the Christ child. Why would the fact that you would come down from glory and take residence in a human body for the sake of saving our weary, fallen world, and what a glorious mystery that is, and what a gift and a sacrifice. Of course, that's scripturally based, but it's not scripture, right? And you'll find that in almost all of the cantatas, and there's some that are actually only for soloists, to complete solo cantatas, that even at the end of a solo cantata, there's a chorale to be sung, right? And it leaves it in the hands, actually, of the congregation to take the message and to absorb it and to think about it, to contemplate it as they leave the service. More musically, though, moving on from just the rhetoric and stuff like that, the idea of why I chose to pair these two is that it's kind of two sides of what sort of a concerto form is. So you have in the Bach, the chorus is not extremely active, right? They sing the first, it's kind of a sprint for the chorus actually. They sing the first movement, and then the soloists do their thing, and they reflect, and they reflect, and they reflect, and then the chorus sings the big hymn at the end, which is really concertist for the orchestra because every solo has an obbligato with it. Or in the case of this one, the whole string section is obbligato with the soloist, or the bass soloist. But the Haydn, however, is almost like a concerto for the choir. So the choir is not really playing backseat. They're not the pips to the soloist Gladys Knight. You understand what I'm saying? Usually you hear this kind of concertante mass, and the soloists are doing tons of stuff, and the choir comes in and they're very subservient. This is not the case. The choir pretty much all the time interrupts the soloist, steps on their line. You don't get to hear the last note of the soloist at all usually because the choir comes in forte, right? And it's a particularly, it's effective and it's dramatic, and it's also indicative of Haydn's sense of humor, right? Haydn was probably, I would say, one of the chief pragmatists when it came to writing masses. And like Bach and many composers of the day, he started under the patronage system. So he was, in the employ for most of his life of the royal Esterhazy family. But unlike many other composers of his day, especially ones that were born in the 1700s, he left the employ of the Esterhazy family and was independently wealthy until he died in 1809. So he had his own money, he bought his own house, he could write what he wanted, he could hire the orchestras he wanted, and write to his heart's content up until the end. But before that, he wasn't so much in control. So when you look, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the Lord Nelson Mass, for instance, the Missa in Angustis. So we hear the full fleshed out version that Haydn revised, which has flutes and oboes and all that. But the original version was just for trumpets, organ, timpani, and strings, and chorus and soloists. Why? Because Nicolaus Esterhazy II decided to fire all the wind players. And he's like, oh, okay, but I still have to write a great mass this week. Here we go. And he did that throughout his career. He was a person who, necessity being the mother of invention, right? He constantly adapted how he wrote and what he wrote for what he had. And all composers really had to do that. But he had some of the best string players you could find, Haydn did. So he had some luxury there, but not always. Also, if you're a fan of Haydn's masses, I happen to be, you notice that he always, even in the big concert masses like this one, always there's an idea that there's business going on. So a mass can't be too lugubrious and too grand because there's processing to do, there's communion to give out, and there's people to get out the door, right? And so especially the longest part of any mass is the creed, okay, the credo. And no matter what setting of the Haydn Mass you'll hear, the credo is always taken sprightly, right? He's getting through. It's like, don't halt my communion. Thank you very much. Get me up to the rail, get me the body and blood, get us out. It's pretty much what he does every time. It even gets to the point where in his short masses, the Missa Brevis, he's about 6 to 8 of those, where he'll have one section of the choir take a portion of the text and just say that. So it's overlapped. So the sopranos will be singing a different part than the basses, and the basses will be singing a different part than the altos. And the whole thing is, liturgically, as long as every part of the credo is said, it's been said. So it doesn't matter if you say the whole thing, just say a portion of it. As long as it's in the air, you can get your communion and get out. Okay? And you'll notice in this Mass, the credo is the most speedy part of the Mass. It just turns, text. But how you know it's a concertist Mass is he decides he wants to take that moment about the incarnation, crucifixion, and death of Christ, and he takes a step back and says, let's give the soloists and the chorus a chance to consider that. Which I think, considering what the Bach cantata talks about, is a really great tie. Otherwise it's just churn, great music, great music with no introspection. But Haydn chooses that moment to take a breath and to have us as the audience ruminate over that for a second, which is so indicative of Advent, right? That's the idea. We're all in waiting for what's to come, because the big hurrah at Christmas is more than 20 days away. Another piece that I would like you to think about as you're listening is just listen to how dominant the winds are in both pieces. How they're more than just colors in the orchestra. They are true soloists in their own right. They're not just there to make it sound even more lovely. They are just as expressive. Actually, because they don't have text, they can actually be a little more emotionally expressive than even the soloists or the singers are, because the singers are bound by the text. They must put that across, and that has to be understood. But the winds get to expand and hang over the entire texture while adding and enhancing it to be so much more than than the sum of its parts. So listen for the winds in both pieces. Listen for the winds in both pieces. So I'm going to take this to what we're preparing next, and so in next semester, we're going to be preparing a piece called Parables, which is an interfaith oratorio. Interestingly enough, right? It takes the texts of the Torah, the Quran, and the New Testament in Koine Greek, and juxtaposes them against one another. And what's truly interesting, what's truly compelling about that, if you think of the programming of an ensemble like this as an arc traveling through the whole year, is this idea of how different people see the same stories. You know, how Bach can look at the incarnation and the sacrifice and the eventual sacrifice of the Christ in his day in the 1700s, how Haydn can reflect with his own tonal language, inherited from Bach, yeah, somewhat, almost 80 years later. And then how you can hear the stories from all of these faith texts talk about the same thing more than 150 years later in a more 21st century harmonic paradigm. And what does that tell us about what faith means and what the import of it is in the human story? And in times, well, we always are thinking about this, but in constantly shifting times, I mean, I don't know about you, but I feel like, some moments where I feel like the pace of the pace of the news cycle, the pace of everything in the world sometimes gets away from me, and I'm a pretty busy guy, so that kind of stresses me out just a little bit. That the ability to sit back, hear sound, and have that be a doorway to examine our shared human story is probably the greatest divine gift of music, right? And I am so thankful that you continue to support the Bennington County Choral Society and continue to journey with us through these various pieces year after year. And I hope you enjoy the concert today. Thank you. Thank you.
Fleisch
thank you again so much for joining us. A wonderful, happy holidays to you and yours. Please stay in contact with us, keep supporting us and music in this area. Thank you very much. Good evening.